nobody tells you about the Tuesday mornings. That's the part they leave out. They tell you about the freedom, the travel, the grandkids, the slow mornings with no alarm clock. All of it true enough, all of it real enough, but nobody pulls you aside before you walk out those doors for the last time and says, "Listen, there's going to be a Tuesday morning about 6 weeks in where you're sitting at the kitchen table with your second cup of coffee, and the house is so quiet you can hear the refrigerator humming. And you're going to look down at your hands and think, what do I do with these now?" Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone watching, just quietly, honestly, the way a man asks himself a question he doesn't have an answer to. I was 67 years old. I had worked for 42 years straight. I had done everything I was supposed to do, and I was sitting there in my own kitchen, in my own house, on a perfectly ordinary morning, feeling like a stranger in a life I had spent 4 decades building. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower was going back and forth. Somebody else had somewhere to be. I had nowhere. For the first time in my adult life, nothing and nobody was waiting on me for anything, and instead of feeling like freedom, it felt like a door had closed behind me that I hadn't heard closing. They gave me a plaque. A good dinner. People said kind things and meant them. And there was applause, genuine applause. And I stood there smiling and feeling proud because I had earned that moment. But nobody warned me about the silence that comes after the applause stops. The kind of silence that sits across from you at the breakfast table and doesn't say a word. I'm 71 years old now, and I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me before that last day, not to scare you. Just because the truth of it, the real unpolished truth of what retirement actually feels like from the inside, is something I needed to hear, and nobody offered it, and I have a feeling I'm not the only one. I started working when I was 16 years old, bagging groceries at a Kroger about 3 miles from the house I grew up in a mid-sized Ohio town that most people have never heard of, and probably never will. It wasn't glamorous work, obviously, but I remember feeling something when I got that first paycheck. Not just the money, though that mattered too because money was always tight in our house growing up. It was something else. It was the feeling of being useful, of showing up somewhere and having a role, a function, a reason to be there. My father worked at a machine parts factory for 31 years, same plant, same shift, and I watched him leave every morning before the sun came up and come home every evening smelling like metal and grease, and he never once complained about it. Not once. That was just what a man did. You worked, you provided. You kept the lights on and food on the table, and you didn't make a big production out of it. That idea got wired into me pretty early, and I carried it with me for the rest of my life. After high school, I did 2 years at a community college, then transferred and finished a 4-year degree in business administration at a state school. Nothing fancy. I worked part-time the whole way through, sometimes 2 jobs at once, and I graduated with a modest amount of debt and a decent enough resume, and a very clear understanding that the world wasn't going to hand me anything. I got my first real job at 23, working as a junior account manager at a regional distribution company outside of Columbus. The pay was nothing special, but it had benefits and a clear enough path forward if you kept your head down and put in the hours, and I was good at both of those things. I was good at showing up early and staying late. I was good at learning the business, figuring out what people needed before they asked, making myself indispensable in that quiet, steady way that doesn't get a lot of fanfare but does get noticed over time. By the time I was 30, I had been promoted twice. By 35, I was managing a team of 11 people. By 40, I was running an entire regional division with real responsibility, real pressure, and a travel schedule that kept me away from home more than I care to admit now, looking back on it. I married Carol when I was 27. She was a school teacher, patient and steady in a way that balanced out my tendency to run at full speed all the time. We bought a house in a suburb of Columbus when I was 32, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with good schools and a neighborhood association that took itself a little too seriously, but that was fine. That was the life we were building. We had 2 kids, our son David and our daughter Melissa, and I loved them more than I knew how to say out loud back then, though I'm not sure I always showed it the way I should have. My work schedule was relentless during those years. I was on the road 2 or 3 weeks out of every month during my peak years, flying in and out of regional offices, sitting in conference rooms in cities that all started to look the same after a while. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Louisville, Seoul, hotel rooms with the same layout and the same bad lighting and the same bad lighting and the same little coffee maker on the dresser. I'd call home at night and talk to Carol for 20 minutes while the news played in the background. Ask about the kids, remind David about his baseball practice, ask Melissa how her science project was coming along, and then hang up and sit in the quiet of another identical room feeling simultaneously proud of what I was building and vaguely aware that I was missing something I couldn't quite name at the time. The work gave me purpose, in a way I didn't fully understand until it was gone. It gave me structure, identity, and a place in the world that was clearly defined. I knew who I was at work. I knew what was expected of me. I knew how to measure whether I was doing well or falling short. There was a clarity to it that I genuinely loved even when the work itself was stressful and exhausting and sometimes maddening. I thrived under pressure. I was the guy people called when something went sideways. I was the one who walked into a difficult situation and figured out how to stabilize it. That reputation meant something to me, more than I realized at the time. Over the years, I changed companies twice, each move intentional and strategic, and I ended my career as a senior director of operations at a logistics firm, a position I held for 14 years before I finally agreed, after some gentle but persistent encouragement from Carol, and a particularly grueling fiscal year that left me more tired than I had ever been in my life, to start thinking seriously about retiring. I was 67 when I finally set the date. I had worked for 42 years straight, without a gap longer than 2 weeks. And on the last day, I walked out of that building with my box of personal items, and my plaque, and the memory of that applause, still warm in my ears. And I felt like a man who had done what he was supposed to do. Finished the race. Crossed the line. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side. I want to be honest with you about what I thought retirement was going to look like, because I think a lot of men my age had the same picture in their heads, and I think that picture is part of what makes the reality so disorienting when it finally arrives. For years, retirement existed in my mind as this warm golden thing just over the horizon. When work got heavy, when I was sitting in an airport at 6 in the morning waiting on a delayed flight, when I was on my 4th consecutive day away from home, and eating room service alone in another hotel room, I would think about retirement the way a thirsty man thinks about water. It was the reward. It was the finish line with a cold drink waiting on the other side. I had this image, and I know how it sounds, but I had this image of slow mornings with no alarm clock, coffee on the back porch watching the sun come up without any urgency, Carol and I finally having the time to just be together without the constant interference of deadlines and travel and the relentless forward motion of a career that never really paused to let you breathe. I imagine reading. I'm not a man who had much time to read for pleasure during my working years, and I always felt a quiet loss about that. Always had a small stack of books on the nightstand that I never got more than 10 pages into before falling asleep. I told myself that in retirement I would finally read all those books. I would work through that stack and then go get more. I imagined long drives with no particular destination, maybe some travel. Carol and I had talked for years about seeing the Pacific Northwest, about driving up the coast of Maine in the fall, about spending a few weeks somewhere warm in January without having to check emails or reschedule anything. I imagined having the bandwidth to actually be present for the grandkids, something I had missed with my own kids, and always quietly regretted. David and his wife had 2 boys by the time I retired, 7 and 9 years old, and I thought, this is my chance. This is where I get to do it right. I also told myself I would get into better shape. Nothing extreme, just walking regularly, maybe some light golf a couple times a week, eating better because Carol had more time to cook real meals instead of both of us surviving on whatever was fast and convenient. I had a whole internal list of things, Retirement was going to give me back time and rest, and presence and pleasure and connection, and I entered into it with genuine optimism. I want to be clear about that. I was not a reluctant retiree. I was ready, or at least I was certain that I was ready, which turned out to be a very different thing. The first week was wonderful. I won't pretend otherwise. There is a genuine and deep relief that comes in those first few days after you stop working, a physical unwinding that you can actually feel in your shoulders and your jaw, and the space behind your eyes. I slept until 7:30 my first morning, which might not sound remarkable, but for a man who had been getting up at 5:15 for the better part of 4 decades, it felt almost sinful. Carol made a real breakfast, eggs and toast, and sliced fruit, and we sat at the table together on a Tuesday morning without either one of us watching the clock, and I remember thinking, yes, this is it. This is exactly what I thought it would be. I took a walk around the neighborhood that afternoon, just a slow loop, noticing things I had never had time to notice before. The way the light came through the oak trees on Whitmore Drive, a garden someone had put in along their fence line with late-season flowers I didn't know the names of, a cat sitting on a porch railing watching me go by like it was mildly disappointed in my pace. Everything felt unhurried and pleasant and full of quiet possibility. The second week was also good, mostly. We drove out to a state park about 40 miles away and walked a trail and had lunch at a little diner on the way home, the kind of place with laminated menus and a pie case up front, and a waitress who called everyone home without any self-consciousness about it. It was a good day, a genuinely good day. I remember thinking on the drive home that this was the life I had earned, and I felt grateful and content and more relaxed than I had been in years. But somewhere in the third week, something shifted. It was subtle, at first, barely noticeable, like a very slight change in the weather that you feel in your joints before you see it in the sky. Carol went back to her routines, her book club and her Tuesday morning walks with her friend Sandra and her Thursday volunteer shift at the local library. She had built a life during my working years, a full and structured life, with people and commitments and a rhythm that belonged to her. And retirement didn't change that life as dramatically for her as I had assumed it would. And I found myself, for the first time, not quite sure what to do with the hours in front of me. I sat with the books I had planned to read and found that my mind wouldn't settle the way I expected it to. I started one, got 30 pages in, and realized I had absorbed almost none of it. I walked around the house in the middle of the morning feeling slightly out of place in my own home, like a guest who had overstayed a welcome that nobody was unkind enough to revoke. The golden picture was still there in the background, still recognizable, but there was something missing from it that I didn't yet have the language to name. I just knew that the quiet I had dreamed about for 20 years felt different when it actually arrived. It felt less like rest and more like absence, and I told myself it was just an adjustment period. I told myself I just needed more time to settle in, to find my rhythm, to let the gears slow down naturally after 4 decades of running at full speed. I was good at being patient with processes. I had managed complex operations for most of my adult life. Surely I could manage a transition into retirement. Surely it would sort itself out. That is what I told myself, and for a while I almost believed it. It started with the mornings. That's the honest answer. The mornings were where I first felt it, that low, hollow feeling that I didn't have a good word for yet, that I kept trying to explain away as tiredness, or adjustment, or just the natural strangeness of a new phase of life. I would wake up around 6, sometimes 6:30, because 42 years of early rising doesn't just disappear because you've stopped setting an alarm, and I would lie there in the gray light of the bedroom listening to the house and thinking, okay, what's today? And there was nothing. No answer, no list of calls to return, no meeting at 9, no decision waiting on my attention, no problem that needed solving before noon. Just the day, wide open and empty and oddly indifferent to whether I engaged with it or not. Carol would still be sleeping. She had always been a better sleeper than me, and I would ease out of bed carefully so as not to wake her and make my way down to the kitchen in the early quiet and stand there in my robe, waiting for the coffee to brew, looking out the window at the backyard, at the bird feeder Carol had put up near the fence line, watching a pair of sparrows take turns at it in the pale morning light. And I would think, this is fine, this is peaceful, and it was, technically. But there was something underneath the peacefulness that I kept noticing and then dismissing, a kind of low-grade restlessness, like an itch you can't quite locate. The phone had gone quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. During my working years, my phone was a constant presence, buzzing and lighting up from the moment I woke until well past dinner, emails and texts and calls from colleagues and vendors and direct reports and upper management, a steady stream of contact that sometimes exhausted me, but also, I understand now, made me feel connected to something larger than myself. In retirement, the phone sat on the kitchen counter and stayed dark for hours at a time. Occasionally, Carol would get a text from one of her friends, or a notification from one of the apps she used, and I would hear that little chime and feel a small involuntary lift of anticipation before remembering that it wasn't for me. My own messages had slowed to a trickle almost immediately after I retired. A few colleagues reached out in the first week or two, the usual warm and well-intentioned notes. Take care of yourself, and you earn this, and we'll have to get lunch sometime. I responded to all of them with genuine warmth and told myself that yes, we would get lunch, we would stay in touch. These connections didn't have to end just because the job had. But the lunches mostly didn't happen. The follow-up messages mostly didn't come. The people I had worked alongside for years, people I had eaten lunch with hundreds of times, people I had sat next to in conference rooms and navigated difficult quarters with and shared bad coffee and worse jokes with, those people had moved on to the next day and the next week and the next problem, the way the working world always does, and I had simply stepped out of the current. I didn't resent them for it. I understood it intellectually, but understanding something and feeling the weight of it are two separate experiences, and the weight of it was heavier than I expected. It was a Tuesday morning about 6 weeks into retirement that I remember with a particular clarity. Carol had left early for her walk with Sandra, and I had driven to the grocery store because we needed a few things, and I needed, though I wouldn't have admitted it out loud at the time, something to do. Something with a beginning and an end, and a small purpose attached to it. I walked through the store slowly, more slowly than I ever had during my working years, when grocery runs were quick and functional, and squeezed between other obligations. I put things in the cart without hurrying. I read labels I had never looked at before. I stood in the cereal aisle for probably 4 minutes, deciding between 2 boxes of the same basic product, and I was aware, in a slightly uncomfortable way, that I was a man with nowhere else to be, stretching a grocery run into something that resembled a morning. The store was mostly quiet at that hour, a weekday morning, and the other shoppers were either elderly people moving at a similar unhurried pace or young mothers with kids in the cart. I nodded to a few people out of habit, the way you do, and nobody nodded back with any particular recognition. I was just another older man in a grocery store, unremarkable, invisible in that ordinary way that public spaces make you invisible when you have no particular role to play in them. I drove home and put the groceries away, and the house was still empty and quiet, and it was barely 10 o'clock in the morning. I had the whole day in front of me. I sat down in the armchair in the living room and turned on the television, something I had rarely done during daylight hours in my entire adult life, and flicked through the channels without landing on anything. And after about 20 minutes, I turned it off again, because it felt wrong somehow, like a concession I wasn't ready to make. David called that week a quick check-in, busy and warm but brief, the kind of call a good son makes to his father out of love and routine, and I was grateful for it and tried not to hold on to it too long, or say anything that would make him feel obligated to extend it. Melissa sent a funny text with a photo of my younger grandson doing something silly in the backyard, and I laughed genuinely and sent back a response, and then set the phone down and looked at the screen for a moment after it went dark. I was proud of my kids. I loved them. but I was beginning to understand that their lives had their own gravity and their own momentum as they should, and I was not at the center of those lives in the way that work had once placed me at the center of something. The evenings were better. Carol and I would cook dinner together or watch something on television, and there was real warmth in those hours, real companionship, and I held on to it gratefully. But the days were long in a way I had never experienced before, long and shapeless and full of small, quiet moments that accumulated into something I still didn't have a name for. I kept waiting for the adjustment to complete itself, kept telling myself that the rhythm would come, that I would find my footing, that this hollow feeling was just the echo of a very loud life going suddenly silent, and that eventually the silence would feel natural. But the days kept coming, slow and unhurried and indifferent, and the feeling underneath them didn't go away. It just got more familiar, and there is something almost worse about a pain that becomes familiar, because at some point you stop waiting for it to leave and start wondering if it belongs there. There was a specific moment, and I have thought about it many times since, turned it over in my mind, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it, and every time I come back to it, I understand it a little more clearly than I did before. It was about 4 months into retirement, a Saturday afternoon in late October, the kind of Ohio fall day that reminds you why you stayed in the Midwest, your whole life, even when the winters tried to talk you out of it. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only shows up in October, deep and clear, and almost severe in its brightness, and the trees on our street were doing their annual thing with the colors, reds and oranges, and that specific golden yellow that makes everything look lit from within. Carol and I had driven over to David's house for what had become a fairly regular Saturday afternoon visit. Nothing formal, just showing up to spend time with the grandkids and have dinner and be part of the rhythm of their household for a few hours. I loved those visits. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely loved being there, loved watching my grandsons tear around the backyard and argue with each other about the rules of whatever game they had invented that week. Loved sitting at David's kitchen table with a cup of coffee while the smell of something good cooking filled the house. But something happened that afternoon that cracked something open in me, quietly and without any drama, the way a hairline fracture forms in a wall before anyone notices it. David and his wife had some kind of home project going, something with a shelf unit in the garage that wasn't coming together the way it should, and David was out there working on it when we arrived, a little frustrated, the way you get with a project that's fighting you. I went out to take a look, because I have always been handy enough around the house, and I looked at the thing and figured out pretty quickly what the issue was, a matter of the anchoring brackets being slightly misaligned. Simple fix, and I told David what I thought, and he nodded and said, "Yeah, that makes sense." And I picked up a screwdriver from his toolbox on the workbench and started to help. And for about 20 minutes out there in that garage, with the cool October air coming in through the open door and the sound of the boys playing in the backyard and the smell of motor oil and sawdust that all garages seem to carry, I felt completely and entirely like myself. I felt useful. I felt competent. I felt like a man with something to contribute, something specific that was needed in that moment. And the feeling was so clean and so immediate and so familiar that I didn't even register it consciously until it was over. We fixed the shelving unit, and David said, "Thanks, Dad, that would have taken me another hour at least." And I said it was nothing, because it was nothing, a 15-minute fix. But the saying of it, and the receiving of it, and the small functional exchange of it, felt like something I had been starving for, without knowing I was hungry. We went back inside, and dinner happened, and the boys were loud and funny, and the evening was warm and good in all the ways I had hoped retirement would be. But on the drive home, sitting in the passenger seat while Carol drove because I had gotten into the habit of letting her drive at night, I sat with something I didn't want to sit with. I kept coming back to those 20 minutes in the garage. Why had that felt so different from everything else I had been doing for the past 4 months? Why had that simple, ordinary, unremarkable act of fixing a shelving bracket felt more like me than anything I had experienced since the day I retired? And I turned that question over in the dark of the car, watching the headlights pull the road ahead of us out of the darkness, and the answer that came back was one I had been circling around for months, without letting myself land on it directly. I had spent my entire adult life being needed, not just wanted, not just appreciated, but genuinely needed. There had always been something or someone that required my specific attention, my specific skill, my specific judgment. For 42 years, I had walked into rooms, and people had looked to me for something: direction, decision, reassurance, expertise, a signature on a document, an answer to a question, a steady hand when things were uncertain. That was not ego, that was function. That was the basic human experience of having a place in the world that fits you specifically, a slot that your particular shape fills. And I had had that for so long that I had come to believe it was simply who I was. And then I retired, and the slot was filled by someone else, and the room kept running without me, and the calls stopped coming, and the questions found other people to land on, and I was left standing in a house I owned, with a schedule I controlled, and absolutely nothing that required me specifically. Anyone could have watched the morning news. Anyone could have taken that slow walk around the neighborhood. Anyone could have stood in that cereal aisle for 4 minutes, weighing two identical boxes against each other. There was nothing in my daily life anymore that was waiting on me specifically, nothing that only I could provide, and that realization, when it finally landed fully and without softening, was one of the loneliest feelings I have ever known. I am not a man who cries easily. My generation wasn't raised that way, and I don't say that with pride exactly. It's just a fact. It's how we were built, and I had gotten through some genuinely hard things in my life without shedding many tears. But that night, after Carol had gone to bed and I was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water in the dark, I felt something move through me that was in the neighborhood of grief. Not grief for a person, not the sharp and obvious grief that comes with loss, but a slower and more diffuse kind, the grief of realizing that a version of yourself you had carried for 40 years had quietly ended, and that nobody had held a service for it, and nobody was going to, because from the outside it just looked like a man enjoying his retirement. The world had not changed. The world was fine. The world had simply moved on, the way it always does, indifferent and efficient and entirely without malice, and I was no longer in it the same way I had been, and all the planning and all the expectations and all the golden pictures I had carried with me toward this finish line had not prepared me for the specific and quiet devastation of becoming optional. I sat there in the dark kitchen for a long time that night. The refrigerator hummed. A car went by on the street outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. The house settled in that way. Old houses do. Small creaks and sighs that you stop hearing after 20 years, and then suddenly hear again when it's very quiet. And I thought about my father, about all those mornings he left before sunrise, and all those evenings he came home smelling like work. And I wondered if he had ever sat in a quiet room and felt this, and I thought he probably had, and I wished I had asked him when I still could. I want to try to describe what the days actually looked like during that period, because I think the details matter more than the broad strokes, and I think anyone who has been through something similar will recognize the specific texture of it, even if the circumstances were different. I was not depressed in the clinical sense, or at least I didn't believe I was. And I want to be careful about that word, because it carries a weight that I'm not sure applies accurately to what I was experiencing. It was something quieter than depression and something more persistent than simple boredom, a kind of low atmospheric pressure that settled over every day and didn't lift entirely even on the good ones. I would wake up in the morning, usually around 6, and the first few seconds were always fine, because in those first few seconds I hadn't yet remembered that there was nothing specific waiting for me. And then I would remember, and there would be the small, almost imperceptible deflation, like air, going out of something slowly. I would make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and watch the backyard come into the light, the bird feeder, and the old oak tree at the back of the lot, and the neighbor's fence with the loose board that had been loose for 2 years, and that I kept meaning to mention. The coffee was good, the view was pleasant. There was genuinely nothing wrong with the moment except for the feeling underneath it, that low hum of purposelessness that I had come to recognize the way you recognize the sound of a car engine that isn't quite right, not broken, not stopped, but not running the way it should. I started filling the mornings with tasks, not because the tasks needed doing particularly, but because having a list gave the day a shape it otherwise lacked. I would find things to fix around the house, small repairs and improvements that I had legitimately put off during my working years, but that I now stretched into longer projects than they needed to be. I repainted the trim on the front of the house over the course of 2 full weeks, when it probably could have been done in 3 days. I reorganized the garage with a thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive labeling bins and installing new shelving and sweeping out corners that hadn't been swept in years. And when I was finished, the garage looked genuinely good, and I stood in the doorway looking at it and felt a brief flicker of satisfaction that lasted maybe 30 minutes before the blankness returned. Carol noticed what I was doing, I think. In that quiet way she notices things, but she was careful about how she approached it, because she knows me well enough to know that I don't respond well to being managed, and I loved her for the care she took, even when the care itself felt like a form of acknowledgement that something was off. I started watching more television than I had in my entire life, which bothered me in a way I found hard to articulate. It wasn't the television itself. Some of what I watched was genuinely good, but the act of sitting in front of it in the middle of a weekday morning felt like a surrender of some kind, a concession to the shapelessness of the days that I kept making and kept feeling vaguely ashamed of. I would watch a couple of hours of news and then feel worse than before I turned it on, because the news was a relentless machine of urgency and catastrophe, and I was sitting in a recliner in Ohio with nowhere to be, and the contrast between the world's frenetic motion and my own stillness was not a comfortable one to sit with. The afternoons were the hardest. There is something about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that I came to genuinely dread during that period. The morning tasks would be done. Lunch would be over. Carol might be out or might be in another room, doing her own things, and the afternoon would stretch out ahead of me in this long, flat, featureless way that made me aware of every passing minute in a way I had never been aware of time before. During my working years, I had never had enough time. There was always more to do than hours to do it in, and time was a resource I managed and protected and was constantly running short of. In retirement, time became something else entirely. It became the thing I was surrounded by, the thing I was swimming in, and it turned out that having too much of something you always wanted is its own particular kind of difficulty. I aged into my own reflection that year in a way that startled me. I had always been vaguely aware of getting older the way most men are, gray at the temples, reading glasses on the nightstand, the occasional morning stiffness that reminded you your body had been keeping score of the decades, even when you weren't paying attention. But without the constant forward momentum of work to keep me focused outward, I started noticing my own physical reality with an attention I hadn't given it before. I noticed the way my hands looked in certain lights, older than I expected them to look somehow, the skin thinner and the veins more prominent in a way that seemed to happen gradually and then all at once. I noticed that I moved more carefully than I used to, that I took the stairs with a hand on the railing without thinking about it, that getting up from a low chair involved a process that my 30-year-old self would have found mildly alarming. None of this was dramatic. None of it was debilitating. But in the quiet of those long afternoons, with nothing to distract me from myself, it accumulated into a kind of awareness of my own diminishment that was uncomfortable and new. I felt invisible in public in a way I had never felt before. At the grocery store, at the gas station, at the hardware store I had been going to for 20 years, nobody looked at me with any particular recognition or expectation. I was a retired man in a baseball cap and comfortable shoes, unremarkable and interchangeable, and the world moved around me with the same efficient indifference it shows to anyone who is no longer visibly engaged in the machinery of things. I didn't expect to be recognized. I didn't need strangers to know who I was or what I had done. But there is a difference between not needing recognition and not feeling its absence, and I felt its absence in a way that was new and unsettling, and that I was too proud to mention to anyone for a long time. The nights were mixed. Some evenings were genuinely good. Carol and I would sit on the back porch after dinner if the weather was decent, talking about nothing in particular the way couples do after 30-some years together, and those hours had a warmth and an ease to them that I was grateful for. But other nights, I would lie awake in the dark after Carol fell asleep, and my mind, which had nowhere useful to go, would go to difficult places. It would catalogue the years and the choices and the things I had missed, and the things I had built, and the question of what any of it added up to now that the building phase was over. And the house would be completely silent, except for the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the structure settling, and I would stare at the ceiling and feel the weight of all that silence pressing down in a way that was hard to describe and harder to dismiss. I have never been a man who dwelled in regret. That was always a point of some private pride for me, the belief that I had made the best decisions I could with the information and circumstances I had at the time, and that looking backward with a corrective eye was a luxury that served nobody, least of all yourself. I held on to that belief for a long time, and I still think there is something true in it. But retirement has a way of loosening the grip you keep on certain things, and in the quiet of those long days I found myself returning to moments I had filed away years ago, opening them back up and looking at them in a different light. And what I found was not a life badly lived, but a life that had certain specific and recurring gaps in it. Gaps shaped almost exactly like the people I loved most. David was 11 years old when I missed his first real baseball game. Not a practice or a scrimmage, but the actual first game of his first real league season, the one he had been talking about for weeks, the one where he was pitching for the first time. I was in Cincinnati for a 2-day meeting that I genuinely could not reschedule, or at least I believe I could not, and Carol took him and watched him pitch 3 innings, and he did well apparently, struck out 2 batters, and she called me after and put him on, and he told me about it with that particular 10-year-old energy that turns every detail into something enormous, and I listened and told him I was proud of him, and that I was sorry I missed it and that I would be at the next one. And I was at the next one, and several after that, and David grew up and played ball through high school and turned into a good man. And I don't think he carries that particular absence as a wound. But I carry it. I carry the image of what I didn't see, Carol sitting alone in those aluminum bleachers with the other parents, while I sat in a conference room 4 hours away. And when I take it out and look at it now, I feel the weight of it in a way I didn't allow myself to feel it at the time, because feeling it at the time would have made the choices I was making very hard to continue making. Melissa was different in the way she communicated what she needed. She was quieter than David, more interior, and she had a way of not asking for things directly that made it easy to miss what she was actually asking for. She was 13 or 14 when she went through a difficult stretch socially, the way girls sometimes do at that age. Friend group drama that I only understood in the vaguest terms because I was rarely home enough to track the details. And she pulled inward the way she did when something was bothering her, and Carol handled it with the skill and presence that she always brought to parenting, and I was largely on the periphery of it, peripherally aware that something was hard for my daughter, but not present enough to do much more than ask a couple of questions at dinner and accept her brief answers as sufficient. I think about that sometimes. I think about whether she knew I would have shown up more fully if she had asked me to, or whether by that point she had simply adjusted her expectations of me downward, in a way that a kid learns to do when a parent is reliably absent in a certain way. I have never asked her directly, and I probably won't. Some questions you carry because the asking of them creates a burden for the person you're asking, and that doesn't feel like the right trade. Carol and I came close to a real rupture once. During my mid-50s, when the travel was at its heaviest and she had been managing the house and the kids and her own teaching career, essentially alone for what felt to both of us, I think, like a very long time. We had an argument one evening that escalated further than our arguments usually did, and she said something that was true and fair and that I was not ready to hear, which was that she felt like she was living alone in a house that happened to have a man in it on weekends. I said something defensive in return that I am not proud of and that I will not repeat here, and we went to bed without resolving it. And the next morning I left early for the airport, and we moved on from it the way busy people move on from difficult things, which is to say, we moved over it rather than through it, and it settled down underneath us, where it stayed for a long time. We are fine now, Carol and I, more than fine. There's a closeness between us in retirement that I am genuinely grateful for, a return to each other that the slowing down has allowed, and I don't want to give the impression that our marriage was unhappy because it was not. But I think about that argument sometimes, and I think about the years of smaller frictions that preceded it. The birthday dinners I was late to and the weekends cut short by Sunday evening work calls, and the vacations that were never quite vacations because my phone was always with me and always active. And I recognize now, with a clarity I didn't have then, that I asked a great deal of my family in the service of a career that, when all was said and done, moved on, without me, with remarkable efficiency. The company I spent 14 of my best years with sent a very nice floral arrangement when I retired, and a card signed by people I recognized and a few I didn't. Within 6 months, my name had probably stopped coming up in meetings. Within a year, someone else had the title and the responsibilities and the seat at the table, and the work continued, and the company continued, and the world continued, and I understood this intellectually and had always understood it intellectually. But there is a difference between knowing that you are replaceable and feeling the actual fact of your replacement, and the feeling is something that no 40-year career fully prepares you for. I don't say any of this to sound bitter. I want to be clear about that, because bitterness is not what I feel when I turn these things over. What I feel is something closer to sorrow, a clean and honest sorrow for the specific costs of the life I chose, costs that were paid mostly by the people who loved me and waited for me and adjusted themselves around my absence without ever being asked to formally agree to that arrangement. I would have made different choices in some places if I had known then what I know now. Not completely different choices. I am not sure I was built for a different fundamental path, but smaller adjustments in the places where it mattered most. More games attended, more evenings fully present, more Saturdays that belonged entirely to the people in my house, and not to the job that was always waiting on the other side of Sunday. I know I cannot go back and make those adjustments. I know that is not how time works. But I also know that carrying the awareness of them is not the same as being crushed by them, and that the carrying itself is a form of honoring the people those moments belong to, even if I can never give them back. At some point, somewhere around the 8 or 9 month mark of retirement, I decided that the waiting had gone on long enough. I had been patient with myself in the way I thought was appropriate, had told myself repeatedly that adjustment takes time, and that the rhythm would come, and that I needed to give the process the space it required, and all of that was probably true and probably necessary. But I had also been using it as a reason not to move, and I recognized that pattern in myself, because it was the same pattern I had seen in employees over the years who were stuck in a difficult situation and had convinced themselves that waiting was the same as working through it. It wasn't. I knew that. So I decided to be deliberate about finding something, some form of purpose or structure or engagement that would give the days a reason to begin and give me something to point myself toward. I want to tell you honestly how that went, because I think the honest version is more useful than the version where everything clicks into place neatly, and the honest version is that it was a process of trial and a fair amount of error, and some things that worked partially, and some things that didn't work at all, and a gradual accumulation of small adjustments that eventually added up to something sustainable, though it took considerably longer than I thought it would. The first thing I tried was golf. I had played recreationally throughout my career, never seriously, never with any real consistency, but enough to know the basics and to enjoy the combination of outdoor air and moderate physical activity, and the kind of conversation that happens naturally when you're walking a course with another person. I joined a public course near the house that had a men's group that played on Wednesday and Friday mornings, and for the first few weeks I genuinely enjoyed it. The physical act of being outside was good for me in ways I could feel. The morning air and the green of the fairways, and the simple satisfaction of a decent shot. But I also found, and this surprised me a little, that the social dimension of it was harder than I anticipated. The other men in the group had mostly known each other for years, had their established dynamics and their running jokes and their shared history, and I was the new man. And while nobody was unwelcoming, the warmth was the polite surface warmth of a group that is comfortable with itself and mildly tolerant of additions to it. I kept going for about 3 months, and the golf itself became a reliable enough pleasure, but it never quite became the community I had been hoping it might. And I accepted that, and kept going for what the outdoor time gave me, without expecting more from it than it was willing to give. I also tried volunteering, which Carol had suggested early on, and which I had resisted for reasons I am not entirely proud of. Reasons that had to do with a stubborn and probably misguided sense that volunteering was something you did when you had nothing more substantial to offer, which is a foolish and dismissive way to think about it, and which I recognized as foolish even as I was thinking it. Eventually, I let that resistance go and signed up to help at a local food bank on Tuesday mornings, sorting and packing and loading, physical work, straightforward and functional, and I want to tell you that it helped in ways I didn't fully expect. There was something about the simplicity of it, the clear and immediate usefulness of it, that cut through the fog in a way that more abstract activities hadn't managed to. Nobody at the food bank cared about my former title or my years of experience or the size of the division I had once managed. What they cared about was whether you showed up on time and worked steadily and didn't need to be told the same thing twice, and those were things I was genuinely good at, and the uncomplicated usefulness of that felt like water to someone who had been thirsty without knowing it. I met a man there named Gerald, 73 years old, retired electrician, who had been volunteering at the food bank for 6 years and who had a kind of settled and unhurried quality to him that I found myself studying without being entirely conscious of doing it. Gerald had figured something out that I was still working on, some accommodation between who he had been during his working years and who he was now, and it showed in the way he carried himself, not resigned, not diminished, just genuinely at peace with the size and shape of his current life. We started getting coffee after our Tuesday shifts at a diner 2 blocks from the food bank, a place with good pie and a corner booth that seemed to be informally reserved for us after the 3rd or 4th time we showed up, and those Tuesday coffees became one of the fixed points of my week in a way that I came to value more than I initially understood. I also went back to the reading I had planned on in retirement, and this time it took, partly because I had stopped pressuring myself about it, and partly because I had found my way to subjects that genuinely held my attention, rather than subjects I thought a retired man of my background should be reading. I found myself drawn to history, American history specifically, the kind of detailed narrative history that reads more like a story than a textbook, and I started going through books at a pace that surprised me, finishing one and immediately wanting the next, and Carol started leaving new ones on the nightstand for me without comment, just quietly keeping me supplied, which was one of the kindest things she did during that whole period. I tried a woodworking class at the local community center, 8 weeks, 1 evening a week, and discovered that I had less natural aptitude for it than I had imagined, but that the learning itself was satisfying in a way that the finished products almost weren't, and I found that interesting, the idea that the doing could matter more than the result, which was not a way I had ever really thought about work during my career, where the result was always the point. I signed up for a 2nd session and then a 3rd, and my projects got incrementally better, and the instructor, a quiet and precise man about my age who had retired from a manufacturing job, became someone I respected and looked forward to seeing each week. What I was building during those months, I understand now, was not a replacement for the career I had lost, but something different in kind, a smaller and more personal structure built from pieces that had no particular prestige attached to them, but that were genuinely mine in a way that a job title never quite is. It was slower work than career building. It was quieter and less measurable, and it didn't come with the clear external validation that professional success had always provided. But it was real, and it was accumulating, and on the days when it was going reasonably well, I could feel the difference in the quality of the morning, the way the day had a shape to it again. A modest shape, but a real one, and I held on to that feeling carefully because I had learned by then how quickly it could thin out if you stopped tending to it. I can't give you a clean date for when things shifted. I wish I could, because there is something satisfying about a turning point you can point to. A specific morning or a specific conversation where the light changed and you knew something had resolved itself. But it didn't happen that way for me, and I suspect it doesn't happen that way for most people going through something similar. It was more like the way a season changes, not in a single day, but in an accumulation of days, each one slightly different from the last in ways that are barely perceptible until you look back across enough of them and realize the landscape has changed entirely. Sometime in the second year of retirement, I noticed that I was waking up in the morning with something that felt different from the hollow feeling I had grown accustomed to. Not excitement exactly, nothing that dramatic, but a kind of quiet okayness, a low and steady sense that the day ahead was manageable, and even, in modest ways, something to look forward to. The Tuesday volunteer shift, and the coffee with Gerald afterward. The history book on the nightstand that I was 2/3 of the way through and genuinely reluctant to finish. The woodworking class on Thursday evening. A walk in the afternoon if the weather was decent. Dinner with Carol. The particular domestic warmth of two people who have been together long enough that the rhythms of a shared evening require no negotiation. These were small things. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to inflate the resolution into something larger and more triumphant than it actually is. The things that had begun to anchor my days were genuinely small, unhurried, unimpressive by any external measure, and the acceptance I had arrived at was an acceptance of that smallness rather than a transcendence of it. I had spent 42 years in a life organized around scale and consequence, and the management of things that mattered in measurable ways. And the life I was building in retirement operated at a fundamentally different register. And learning to find that register, not just tolerable, but genuinely sufficient, was the actual work of this period. Quiet and internal, and not the kind of thing that shows up on any resume or earns any applause. I had a conversation with Carol one evening that I think of as the closest thing to a real turning point I can identify. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, the kind of warm late spring evening that makes Ohio feel worth everything the winters cost you. And I said something out loud that I had been carrying internally for a long time. I told her that I had spent most of the past year and a half feeling like I was waiting for retirement to become what I thought it was going to be, and that I was starting to think that waiting was the wrong relationship to have with it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she thought I had been grieving something, and that grief tends to move at its own pace regardless of what you want from it, and that she had watched me working through it and was glad I seemed to be coming out the other side. I didn't say much in response because I was sitting with the word grieving and recognizing how precisely it fit, more precisely than anything I had come up with on my own. I had been grieving, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone looking in from the outside, but genuinely grieving the loss of an identity that had been central to me for most of my adult life, and the grief had its own timeline and its own requirements, and it had needed to move through me at the pace it chose rather than the pace I would have preferred. The acceptance that came on the other side of that grief was not the golden retirement I had imagined. It was quieter than that, and more honest than that, and in some ways more valuable than that, because it was real, and it was mine, and it had been earned through actual difficulty rather than arrived at through wishful thinking. I stopped measuring my days against the days I used to have. That was perhaps the most important single shift, the one that made the others possible. As long as I was comparing the scale and significance and external validation of my current life to the scale and significance and external validation of my working life, I was going to lose that comparison every single time because the comparison was fundamentally unfair, like measuring a conversation against a keynote address and finding the conversation wanting. Once I stopped making that comparison, or at least once I made it less automatically and less constantly, the days began to have their own integrity, their own sufficient meaning that didn't require external justification. I was 70 years old and I was alive. And the morning light through the kitchen window was genuinely beautiful. And the coffee was good. And Carol was in the next room and Gerald would be at the food bank on Tuesday. And there was a good book on the nightstand. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. I want to talk to you directly for a few minutes, if that's all right. Not as someone who has figured everything out, because I haven't. And not as someone standing on higher ground, trying to offer you a view I'm not sure I've fully earned. Just as a man who has been through something and wants to share what it taught him, honestly and without dressing it up into something more useful sounding than it actually is. If you're somewhere between 50 and 70 years old, and you're either approaching retirement or already in it, and something in this story has felt familiar to you, then I think you already know most of what I'm about to say. But sometimes it helps to hear it from someone who has been in the same room. The first thing I would tell you is that the silence is real, and it is allowed to be hard. I spent a long time trying to talk myself out of the difficulty of the transition, trying to reframe it and minimize it and rationalize it, because I felt that a man who had worked hard his whole life and provided well and reached the finish line in decent shape had no legitimate reason to struggle with the reward. That thinking was wrong and it cost me time. The silence after a loud life is a real loss, and losses deserve to be acknowledged rather than argued with. Giving yourself permission to find it hard is not weakness. It is the first honest step. The second thing I would tell you is to be careful about isolation, and I say this as a man who is naturally somewhat private and who had to learn this the hard way. The working world provides a social structure that most of us don't fully appreciate until it's gone. The daily human contact, the shared purpose, the casual conversations that accumulate into a sense of belonging. When that structure disappears, you have to rebuild something in its place, and that rebuilding requires intention, because it does not happen on its own. It does not matter much what the structure looks like. It could be a volunteer shift, or a regular golf game, or a coffee with a friend, or a class at the community center, or a neighbor you start actually talking to instead of just waving at. What matters is that it is consistent, and that it involves other human beings, and that it gives you somewhere to be that is outside the four walls of your own house on a regular basis. Do not underestimate this. I underestimated it badly in the early months, and the underestimation had real costs. The third thing, and this one is specifically for the men in the audience, because I think we carry this particular burden in a way that is distinct and that we don't talk about enough, is that your identity was probably more tied to your work than you realized, and untying it is a real process that takes real time and cannot be rushed or bypassed. This is not a character flaw. It is the natural result of spending the majority of your waking hours for 4 decades in a role that defined how you moved through the world, how people related to you, how you understood your own value. When that role ends, the identity question that follows is genuine and serious. And the answer to it does not come from finding a new role that replicates the old one's scale or prestige. The answer comes from a slower and more internal process of discovering which parts of yourself exist independently of what you did for a living, and then building a daily life around those parts. That process is humbling and sometimes uncomfortable and ultimately, I believe, worthwhile. I would also tell you to pay attention to your marriage or your closest relationship during this transition, because retirement changes the domestic landscape in ways that can create real friction if you're not paying attention. Carol and I had to renegotiate our household in ways that neither of us entirely anticipated. The division of space and time and routine in a home that now had 2 full-time occupants instead of 1, and we navigated it imperfectly and sometimes with friction. And I think we came through it better than many couples do, because Carol is a patient and perceptive woman, but also because we eventually talked about it directly rather than letting the friction accumulate silently. If your relationship has been running on a particular set of assumptions for decades, retirement will test some of those assumptions, and the testing is better done openly than not. Finally, I would tell you that the smallness of a retired life is not a diminishment, unless you decide it is. I spent too long measuring my days against the days I used to have, and finding them lacking. And that measurement was unfair and self-defeating, and it stole time from me that I would like to have back. A slow morning with good coffee and a book you're genuinely interested in is not a consolation prize. A Tuesday volunteer shift where you do useful work alongside decent people is not a lesser version of a career. A walk in the afternoon through a neighborhood you've lived in for 30 years and still find things in worth noticing is not a waste of the day. These things are the day. And the day, lived honestly and with some degree of presence, is what you have, and it is enough. I am sitting at the kitchen table as I tell you this, which is where I seem to do most of my thinking these days. And the morning light is coming through the window at that low angle. It gets in the late part of the year, cutting across the table in a wide, pale band, and catching the steam rising from my coffee cup in a way that I find genuinely beautiful, the kind of small and unremarkable beauty that I would have walked right past during my working years without registering it at all. The backyard is quiet. A pair of cardinals is working the bird feeder, the male bright red against the gray of the November morning, the female a subtler russet brown beside him, and I have been watching them for about 10 minutes now without any particular agenda, just watching, and it occurs to me that this is something I am still learning to do, to be present in a moment without simultaneously managing it or measuring it or preparing for what comes next. I am 71 years old, and I'm still learning how to simply be somewhere, which strikes me as both a little funny and a little sad, and mostly just honest. Carol is still asleep upstairs. I can hear the particular silence of a house with someone sleeping in it, which is different from the silence of an empty house in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that I have become very attuned to over the past few years. And the difference matters to me more than I would have expected. The house with Carol sleeping in it is a full silence. The other kind I know too well, and I am grateful this morning for the full kind. I think about the man I was 4 years ago walking out of that building with his plaque and his box and the sound of applause still warm in his ears, and I feel for that man in a way that is tender rather than critical. He had worked hard and done his best and built something real, and he had no way of knowing what was waiting for him on the other side of the finish line, because nobody had told him and he hadn't thought to ask. He thought the hard part was behind him. He thought the reward was arriving. And in some ways it was, and in some ways the hardest and most important work of his life was just beginning, and it was the kind of work that didn't come with a job description or a performance review or a salary or a title, the work of figuring out who you are when the thing that told you who you were for 40 years is no longer there to answer that question. I think he did all right with it, that man. Not perfectly. Not without struggle and confusion and some long, quiet nights that he would not want to revisit. But all right, and all right, I have come to believe, is a more honest and more durable destination than the triumphant golden retirement he had been picturing all those years on the road. Because all right is real, and it is earned, and it fits the actual shape of the human life rather than the shape of an expectation. I am not the man I was at 55, running at full speed through airports with a phone in my hand and a calendar full of things that needed me. That man is gone, and I have stopped trying to recover him. The man I am now moves more slowly and notices more, and has more time for the people he loves, and less patience for the things that don't matter. And that is not a bad trade, even if it was not the trade I would have chosen consciously or made without difficulty. The cardinals are still at the feeder. My coffee has cooled slightly the way it does when you've been sitting with it long enough to actually think about something. In a little while, Carol will come downstairs, and I will pour her a cup, and we will sit together in the morning light and talk about nothing in particular, or nothing at all, and that will be enough, and I will know that it is enough, and the knowing will not require any effort. That is what I have been working toward, I think. Not happiness exactly, not the word I would use, but something quieter and more reliable than happiness. A settled sense that the life in front of me, however much of it remains, is worth showing up for fully and without reservation. That is what I have. That is what I hope for you. If you stayed with me this long, through all of it, The quiet mornings and the long afternoons in the garage in October and the kitchen in the dark, then I want you to know that I am genuinely grateful for your company. There is something about telling a story like this, honestly and without the polished edges, that requires a listener. And you have been that, and it matters more than you might think to an old man sitting at a kitchen table with a cooling cup of coffee and a pair of cardinals outside the window. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with one question, not a rhetorical one, not a trick. Just a real and honest question that I have been sitting with myself and that I think is worth sitting with if you are anywhere near the season of life I have been describing. When the thing that has defined you for most of your adult life is no longer there to define you, who are you then? And is that person someone you have taken the time to know? I don't ask that to unsettle you. I ask it because I wish someone had asked it of me 20 years ago, quietly and without urgency, so that I might have had more of an answer ready when the silence arrived. If this story felt true to something you have lived, or are living, or are beginning to see on the horizon, I hope it gave you something useful, even if that something is simply the knowledge that the feeling you have been carrying is not yours alone, and that other people have walked through the same quiet and come out the other side, still standing. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, honest and unhurried, and told from the inside of a life rather than the outside of one, it would mean a great deal if you would subscribe to this channel, not because the number matters for its own sake, but because every person who subscribes is saying that this kind of storytelling is worth continuing, and that kind of encouragement, quiet and simple as it is what keeps an old man at his kitchen table with something worth saying. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself out there.